In a small Samaritan town known as Sychar, Jesus and the disciples stop at the historic water well of Jacob. It is about noon. The disciples walk into town to find food. Jesus, weary from the journey, sits down at the well. He watches as a Samaritan woman comes alone to draw water. Unexpectedly, he speaks to her.
"Would you draw water and give me a drink?"
You are a Jew. I'm a woman from Samaria. Why are you asking me for water? Why are you talking to me?
If you knew the gift of God and who it is that asks for a drink, you would have asked him and he would have given you living water.
Sir, you sit by this deep well, a thirsty man, without a bucket in sight. Tell me, where does this living water come from?
Everyone who drinks this water will be thirsty again. Whoever drinks the water I give them will never thirst. The water I give will become a wellspring within that gives life throughout eternity.
Wow. Please give me some of this water so I can never ever be thirsty and never have to carry this bucket again.
Go, get your husband and come back here.
I don't have a husband.
That's nicely put. You are telling the truth. You have no husband now. But in the past, you've had 5 husbands. The man you're living with now is not your husband.
You're a prophet.
Oh, so you're a prophet? You know all? So I have a question for you. Our men, our fathers, served at this mountain, but you say all people should serve in Jerusalem. Which is it?
Neither. A new day is coming. In fact, a new day is already here. What you are called will not matter. Where you go to worship will not matter. God is spirit. The Father seeks those who worship in spirit and in truth.
I don't know about all that, but I do know that the Messiah is coming. And when he arrives, we'll get the whole story. We'll get the truth when the Messiah arrives.
I am he. You don't have to wait any longer or look any further.
Just then, the disciples come back. They cannot believe Jesus is talking with this woman from Samaria. No one says what they are thinking, but their faces show it. The woman takes the hint and leaves. She is so shaken up by this conversation with Jesus, she leaves her water bucket behind. Back in the town, she stops people in the streets to tell them what happened.
You know, I met a stranger that knew everything about me, my past, my future. Do you think he could be the Messiah? Well, I guess you just have to come and see. You just have to come and see.
And that is the scripture from John 4. And I'm going to invite you to go ahead and take your Bibles and open them up. If you're looking at your Pew Bible, you will be looking at page 94 in the New Testament. And I want to give a quick thank you to my wonderful friend, Yolanda Pendleton, for bringing that to life for you, as well as Pastor Caroline Knoll from either the Narthex or the Balcony, and Patrick LaBruyere. So can we give them a quick acknowledgement? Thank you very much. So my name is Kim Ingram, and oh my goodness, it is really, really early. Pastor Valerie invited me to bring the message today, and I didn't quite put together this would also be daylight savings time, and I have to confess that this morning I very nearly put coffee creamer on my toast. It's really, really early. So we're looking at the story of the woman at the well. And I'm hoping very much that this is a story that's fairly familiar to you. I'm looking out at some of the faces, and I know some of you have taught Bible study for years, so I know you're really familiar with the story. And when I said that I would go ahead and come talk about the woman at the well today, I felt kind of qualified to do it because I've read the story several times, and I felt like I knew it well. And oh my goodness, I learned that I actually didn't know it very well at all. And so I wanted to share a few of the things that I learned with you this morning. And the first thing that we want to do is we want to kind of put this story into context. So I wanted to bring up that first slide. So I don't know if you know this, but the place that we're at is called Jacob's Well. And if you would like to see it, it still exists today. And I thought that that all by itself was rather amazing. This is a picture of it. This actually is Jacob's Well. And if you want to see it, you would travel to the Holy Land, and then you'll have to go through some checkpoints because it happens to be like Bethlehem and like Nazareth and some of the other holy places in our Christian history. They're in the West Bank. And so if you look at this, you can bring up the next slide as well. This is more of a look at the authentic opening to the well. There's been an edifice built around it to kind of keep it from collapsing, and of course they've added a lot of modern touches to it through the years. And then they've built up an Orthodox congregation around it. There's an Orthodox church there. And the people who worship there are Palestinian Christians, and they speak Arabic. So just kind of an interesting little eye-opening look at that. So it's a real place. Now if we can bring up the next slide. Here's the next, oh, and that's a view of the church. So it's a really, really pretty church. And next slide after that. So here's another thing that I don't know where I was when everyone got this memo, because I may be about to share something I didn't know about this story that you, of course, know. I don't know why I didn't know it. We're in Samaria, so we're talking about the Samaritans, of course, and the story that we're all familiar with that concerns Samaria is, of course, the story of the Good Samaritan. So we all know the story of the Good Samaritan. We were taught it in Sunday school. And when we think about that story, I think what we were taught was that the Samaritans were outcast. They were the other. They were the people who were just despised. And it never occurred to me in Sunday school to ask myself, why? Why were these people so despised? I just kind of accepted it. But when I had to take a dive into the story, I did start asking what Pastor Caroline calls wondering questions. And I just did just the tiniest little bit of research. And let me ask you this. Did you know that the Samaritans are Jewish? Raise your hand if that's news. Me too. I was like, what? They're Jewish. So here's the way that works. Without going into too much of the Bible history, there were two major invasions that swept over the kingdom. And the very first one was by the Assyrians, and it took out the northern kingdom first. And the northern kingdom, that's the Samaritans. So when the Assyrians come through and they conquer, the people who lived in that area of the kingdom, you can kind of see it on the map a little bit. The people who lived in that area, they were either exiled, or if they stayed in that area, they were forced to share their land and all they had with the occupiers. So now we have kind of a new thing going on where you have these new people coming in and they bring their own traditions, their own religions, their own gods. They set up idols. And of course, it's a whole century before the southern kingdom is then conquered by the Babylonians. We have an entire century of time passing. So just like any time that you have when people are living and they're working, making a life side by side, there is intermarrying, there is a mix of these cultures. And then centuries and centuries more pass, and now we are just so far ahead in history at the time that this story is happening. But what's happened is the temple has been rebuilt, and the people who are in the southern kingdom, the Judeans, they look at the Samaritans as not only the outcasts, but they were intermarrying, which meant that they were not purely Jewish anymore. They were defiled. And also, they had married people who worship idols, so there was that risk of idol worship. So what you have here is basically a fight between people who are from the same faith background, who came into the promised land. They're descended from the people who came into the promised land all together from the same background. And now we have two factions of that faith, and they are locked in this big fight. The Samaritans have their own version of the Torah, and they have their own traditions, and they are locked in this fight of who's right, who is right. So with all of that context in mind, if you would look again at your story at these Bible verses from John 4, when you look at the very beginning of it, what you start to realize is that this is an incredibly dramatic story. To me, it had always seemed like a very gentle story. But with all of that context, I realized that first, Jesus had come to Samaria at all. Because if you were a pious Jew, you did not come into Samaria. If you came into contact with a Samaritan, you felt like you had to wash your hands and cleanse before you were ready to be at the temple again. So the fact that he's even in Samaria, and then second, he's talking to a woman, that was not done in public. These are strangers, and strange men and women are not supposed to talk together in public. So that's the next thing that's kind of a new understanding of this particular Bible story. And then third, he's talking to a Samaritan. And fourth, he is asking her for water, which implies that he is willing to drink water from a Samaritan vessel drawn by a Samaritan hand. So now you know, wow, we're in a really new territory here. So the disciples have gone into town, they're buying food, and a woman comes and she approaches the well, and it's noon, and it is so very hot. And she is carrying a vessel that's probably very heavy. If you can imagine yourself, even with a little mini Ozarka bottle, even that little mini thing, and having to carry that a long distance to a well and then fill it up and pick it up and carry it back to your home, this really would have been something. It's a big chore. And so the very next question to ask is, why would you do this chore at noon? Why at noon? The common time to come to the well would have been in the morning or in the evening when it's cool, and probably the whole community would gather and we would work together to do this chore. But the Samaritan woman is here at noon. And I started to ask myself again, why? Why is she there at noon? And I wondered about it. Here's how the story has always been taught to me in the past. In the past, and if you can look at it, it's about in 4:21, we have that conversation that takes place between Jesus and this woman. And he tells her, you've been married 5 times, and the person that you're living with now is not your husband. And the way that that's been taught to me in the past is that this is a fallen woman. This is a woman who's been married 5 times, and now she's living in sin, and yet Jesus is talking to her, reaching out to her, offering her living water, and her life is changed. So it was taught to me as a redemption story. But instead, when I took a little dive into this story, I started asking myself, why is she married 5 times? And I just got curious about it. And I walked around with this girl in my head for a long time. And I asked myself, who are you, woman at the well? Why have you been married 5 times? And finally, I thought to look up something about marriage laws in that time and culture. And I wanted to bring up Deuteronomy 24. Now, this is a little bitty slide. I didn't realize that the text was so small when I made it. It looked really big on my computer. So you might not be able to read it. But I can kind of summarize it for you. I won't be going word for word on this because I can't read it. But I can tell you this. Suppose a man enters marriage with a woman and he becomes displeased with the woman and he gives her a certificate of divorce, dismisses her from the house. If she then goes and she takes a second husband and she enters into the second marriage, and the second husband also becomes displeased with her and gives her a certificate of divorce and dismisses her from the house, or the second husband dies, the first husband cannot take her back and marry her again because that would be defilement. Now that's just a glimpse of what the marriage laws look like from Deuteronomy 24. From our own Old Testament that we read. And as soon as I looked at that, I all of a sudden had that aha moment and realized women did not have any control over their marriages. They had no control whatsoever. They were entering into these covenants because that was the only way that they could be supported. They didn't have the ability to work or be independent. And they were often told who to marry. And then why would they be dismissed from a marriage? Well, you would hope that people would take that pretty seriously. But if they were dismissed from a marriage, it would be for things like you couldn't bear children. That would have been a legitimate reason. Another really common way that you might have multiple marriages is that, gosh, people died young. This is a full 1,000 years before we had any thought of anything that looked like antibiotics, probably even more than that. So if you were injured and got a wound, that could be a death sentence. So 5 marriages, to me, doesn't really even seem like it's that unusual. So all of a sudden, what I was looking at with this woman at the well was a person who is not a fallen woman per se, but instead, she's probably a survivor. She's probably someone who has endured so much tragedy in her life, and now it's noon, and the sun is high overhead, and there's not a shadow in sight. And she comes to the well, and this strange man talks to her. And I wonder why she talks to him. And I thought, I wonder if she's at the well at noon because she's an outcast. And I thought, well, that very well could be, because people tended to hold you responsible for your misfortunes back in this time. They said if something bad is happening to you, it must be because you're deserving of punishment. God must be punishing you. And people often didn't want to be associated with people who had had kind of a run of bad luck because maybe that would rub off. So I could see that. And I could see, well, maybe she engages in this conversation that she's not supposed to be having because she's really hungry for that companionship. And now you have a man who is speaking to her, and maybe she would have really liked to keep the idea that she had been married 5 times, that tragedy of her life. Maybe she really would have liked to keep that hidden. But again, there's no shadows, sun, high in the sky. And this man looks at her and says, yeah, you've had 5 husbands. The person you're living with now is not your husband. So everything is known. All the tragedies of her life are known. But this person is not backing away from her. This person is offering living water. And she is a little bit transformed by this encounter. One last little new understanding, which I thought was amazing. She says, listen, I know we're going to know the truth when the Messiah comes. And I wonder, does she suspect that who might be who she's speaking to? And he looks at her and he says, I am he. I am he. And if you look in all of John 1, 2, and 3, you see the call of the disciples. But he had never revealed his identity up to this precise moment. And the first person who hears him proclaim himself to be the Messiah is a woman at the well in outcast Samaria. So it's rather amazing to think about her with this new understanding. So here's what I'd like to leave you with today. And it's just the idea of, what does this story mean for us? One is that Jesus knows everything about us. Nothing is hidden. If we walked to the well for a meeting with Jesus, the sun would be high in the sky, and there would be no shadows, and everything would be known. So whatever you're carrying that you feel like, if anyone knew that, that would be a deal breaker. He knows all of it. And still, the living water is offered. Here's the next idea. What is living water? What is living water? I read this on a sermon blog, and it asked this. If you want to figure out what living water is, ask yourself, what is dead water? And I thought, that is a very dramatic little phrase, dead water. And it said, think about all of the things in your life that you're doing that no longer nourish you. They do not feed you. They do not make your life better, and yet you keep doing them. And when you look at the story, it could very well be a template for a lot of things that are dead water. If you find yourself in a continuing conversation or kind of argument with someone, in a push and pull over who's right, and everybody is locked in and nobody's giving even an inch, that might be dead water. If you find yourself having faced some kind of tragedy in your life and it seems beyond your control, and people are now treating you like an outcast, and you are carrying all this grief or resentment, and you're carrying it around, that's another example of something that very well might be dead water. It's water that just does not nourish you or quench your thirst. You're always going to be thirsty again if you keep going back to those same types of things that do not help you grow in your faith. But here is the Messiah, and he is offering living water. And so the very last thing that I want to invite you to do is just think for just a minute. What would living water be? What would it look like? What would it mean in your life? What would change if you accepted the gift and you drank of it? I think the answer might be different for everybody. And you can look at this entire Bible story as a template for a prayer. Because all of this, your hardest questions, your griefs, anything that you're carrying, you can bring it and you can ask the question, what is living water? You can ask it of the man at the well. Amen.